Well, we're all too often told that democracy is in recession across the world. I mean, you think about Poland under the Law and Justice Party, it's become increasingly illiberal. Erdogan's Turkey has drifted towards authoritarianism, and many Western commentators put Hungary in that camp. Australians don't really have a very good sense of Hungary, which is strange given that there have been several waves of immigrants from Hungary to Australia, most notably after the 1956 Hungarian uprising, which happened to coincide with Melbourne hosting the Olympic Games that year. So we thought we'd speak with one of Hungary's leading intellectuals. Mate Hajba is director of the Free Market Foundation in Hungary. Mate, welcome to Australia.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to tell you that in the short time I've been here, I've met many people who had Hungarian friends, and I was pleasantly surprised that basically everybody knows someone Hungarian in Australia.
Yes, that's right. Well, it's not just the Hungarian uprising. There was after World War II and, of course, the end of the Cold War, where we had pretty significant waves of Hungarian immigrants. But as I say, we very rarely talk about Hungary. However, some people do talk about your Prime Minister, Orbán, controversial character, but he's had a remarkable and enduring political career. I think he's won 4 out of the last 6 elections. Tell us more about Orbán.
Well, I think Orbán is one of the most decisive figures in recent times in Hungary. After the fall of communism in the early 90s, late 80s, he's been one of the most detrimental politicians in the history of Hungary. He basically defined the road Hungary is taking at the moment. And he's a very controversial figure, to say the least, because he's attacked and criticized a lot, and mostly the criticism is justified. However, although I'm very critical of him, I don't think that Hungary wouldn't be a democracy anymore. He just made a very shrewd distinction between liberal and illiberal democracy. So he had a very infamous speech in 2014 when he declared that he's building an illiberal state in Hungary based upon or modeled upon countries such as Russia or China, which are, not the best of examples as democracy goes. However, he clarified this by saying that Hungary is still a democracy, and I agree, but it's an illiberal democracy. And it's very hard to put a finger on what this means, because there is an undeniable erosion in the rule of laws and in the checks and balances in Hungary. However, it is not impossible to win elections. There are multiple parties working legally. On paper, you can set up free press. However, it is also true that many of the other rankings, for example, Freedom House ranks Hungary as a partly free country, as so far it goes for freedom of the press.
We have to stress here that Hungary under Orbán still has political opponents, correct?
Yes, certainly. They are not the most pragmatic people, unfortunately, and it's also true that the Hungarian electoral law basically is biased for the governing party. However, on paper, you are able to win elections against the government.
Okay, take us back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. He was clearly rebelling. He made his mark as an opponent of Soviet imperialism, and obviously was one of the leading figures behind the movement to fight communism. And yet in more recent times, he's widely seen as an advanced man for Vladimir Putin in the European Union and in NATO. He's even called the leaders in Washington and Brussels globalists. How do you account for that?
Well, Orban certainly had a huge U-turn somewhere in the mid-90s. So he became famous by declaring, he was one of the first people in Hungary who openly declared that the Soviet troops in Hungary should go back to Russia, which was a very rebellious thing at the time to say openly. And he was a staunch classical liberal, and he slowly turned towards a more conservative approach, a Christian conservative approach, and now basically nobody knows what he's still declaring to be a center-right figure. However, I would declare that he's more populist than ideologically based. He realized very pragmatically, I would have to say, that the will of the people, the will of the majority of the people, is what he should respond to rather than be an ideological leader. And he realized very well that there are certain aspects of society that is not going to be swayed either left or right. They will respond to ideas that will cater to their own needs. And in that case, of course, it's a democracy, and Orbán won elections 4 times. So it's undebated that he's popular, and he's a very good leader for those people who voted for him. However, in order to be this good leader and be a populist, he had to overstep certain things, for example, the rule of law, and there's a blatant amount of corruption in Hungary, which is very fearful.
Okay, but Hungary is part of the European Union and NATO, and yet Orban clearly has a very close relationship with Moscow. Why?
Well, Hungary has always been on the fence whether to belong to the East or the West. So it's been a historic struggle for Hungary, and Hungary is clearly set towards the European Union and the NATO alliance, and America. The US is one of our strategic partners. However, under Orban's regime, there was a certain direction called the Eastern Opening, when Hungary opened up economically towards post-Soviet states and China, and obviously Russia is one of the main targets of this Eastern Opening, which is not the best. I think that Orban was one of the first European leaders who invited and hosted Vladimir Putin after the Crimean crisis and the crisis in Ukraine, and that went opposite to the trend in the European Union, when nobody was willing to sit down with Vladimir Putin. However, Hungary and Orban in particular has been very, very friendly with Russia, and in many cases Orban is doing exactly the same thing as Vladimir Putin has done. For example, the attack on NGOs or the free press has been done in the same way as in Russia.